Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Mark Robbins with the SIP Forum, and we are in day 5 of SIPNOC 2022 and the third session of the day entitled Consumer Enterprise Trust in Branded Calling. Are we there yet? It's my pleasure to welcome Rebekah Johnson, founder and CEO of Numerical, who's going to moderate today's session. Hi, Rebekah.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
And our panelists include Scott Davis, who's president and co-founder at Volley. Hi, Scott.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody.
We've got Linda Vanderloop, AVP, External Affairs Regulatory at AT&T, and she's also chair of the STI Governance Authority. Hi, Linda. We've got Shamim Feroz Akhtar, distinguished engineer at Verizon. Sorry, I mangled your name, Shamim. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
And finally, we've got Lulia Barakats, who's senior manager planning at Verizon. Hi, Lulia.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for having us.
I'm going to turn things over to you now, Rebekah. Stage is all yours.
All right, thank you. And a special thanks to each of the panelists today. I do realize that you have spoke multiple times already at SIPNOC. Linda was just in an appearance earlier. So thank you. I really wanted to pull this panel together so that we could really dive into the topic of trust and whether or not, where we are at with regards to trust in the infrastructure that we have established and built. And so we also have Scott Volley, who is a new face to the SIPNOC group, representing on the brand side. So I want to kind of cover just a quick little overview. Enterprise brands want to present their verified identity. When it comes to speaking with consumers, and ultimately, presenting that verified identity is to establish trust, and also, let's be honest, is to increase calls, the answer rate. So rich call data, as we've discussed during this week, will ultimately originate from the brand. And that's an important part of this to remember and understand that it starts at the brand. But the brand, however, may be multiple providers removed from the origination point of the call. And by providers, I'm referring to the solution providers within that specific vertical. And Scott from Volley is going to represent the dealership vertical, and we'll hear more from him on how that's kind of structured and how far away the brand is from the origination point. So when it gets down to the service provider who is actually signing the call and adding this rich call data to the call, we still have areas lacking in trust of the data provided, because even the originating provider doesn't know if they can really trust that data. And this is, just at the originating point. So when this data then traverses the telco network and terminates in the wireless carrier provider, which is AT&T Verizon on this call, they clearly question the validity of the data they are being asked to present to the consumer. So today we are going to explore those trust factors. This is not specific to technology, but really, where are we with trusting the data being provided and delivered through the network? What steps, towards trust have we made? And then what do we still need to consider? And I want to give a little overview of things that we have seen to address this concern for trust. The Nancy Catta Group, we all are aware, hopefully by this point, they highlighted the importance of proper vetting. So that's that brand, that identity, who is it that wants to have their identity and their branding assets associated with the call. So although there were some best practices, it wasn't scriptive of what the vetter specifically should do. And I know Linda's going to kind of get into some of that topic as well. But that was, a good report and a step in the right direction. We have seen some service providers are collaborating on best practices. This requires testing things out. There's proof of concepts. We did see a couple of press releases. Comcast put one out, T-Mobile put one out around their testing of delegated certificates. Again, that's a technology, but ultimately trying to test out how do we get down to the brand, how do we put it at origination, how do we deliver it, and how do we receive something that we trust. Industry is focusing on standards as well, looking, can we put trust in those locations? And ultimately what we're just looking for when we look at the players involved on the enterprise, the consumer, and the service provider. And service provider, we're going to try to be really good today about being specific, because sometimes we are really talking about a very specific service provider and it shouldn't include everybody. But in that service provider bucket, it's all the different players along the path of origination to termination and everyone in between. I think we can all come to the table and say, trust matters. And it will require, beyond the telco network, beyond regulators, it requires consumers and enterprises to also have input and feedback into this process of trust. So I'd like to first get started and kick off with Scott specifically on, I think it's really important to understand the structure of the different verticals. Now, Stir Shaken and branded calling and RCD and verified, it hits any vertical that's delivering outbound communications. And one thing that we've discovered is each vertical might be set up differently to eventually get to that origination point for their call on their network. And we need to take that into consideration. And for the listeners and participants at SIPNOC, these are the people solving these problems. And I think it's really important for them to understand the intricacies of just, let's speak to the dealership vertical, if you would.
Yeah, thank you. Volley works with automotive dealerships. We've got a call center application that they use. That's just one component of what is in the dealership. So your typical medium-sized dealership may have 400 phone numbers and 5 different providers. The dealers are massively worried that they've got a good reputation. They may have a provider for their PBX system. They may have Volley. They may have a call analytics partner and an ad trafficker that they're doing click to call through their CRM. And they also may be outsourcing some calls that they don't get to. They're making good phone calls that the customer wants, but they've got 5 different providers. They're very concerned that their reputation's good, that their calls get through, and this is an important topic to them.
Yeah, and I think, that's just kind of reiterating that, keeping identity and authentication is at the core of trust. We, verifying it and then the integrity of it as it passes through. And that it's interesting, we don't think about that, I think, often in the telco space, that it also includes these service providers who are not necessarily telco, because there's several different hops before we get down to the actual dealership that's saying, hey, I have an identity that I want to protect. But there's multiple solution providers that are layered on top of that. And would you agree with regards to when it comes to their voice communications or messaging, whatever it may be, they're passing that off to somebody else to worry about?
Yes, of course. And they have very few technical resources within the dealership, even very large ones. They pass it off. Most of the vendors they use are using a third-party provider to originate that call. I don't think it's a problem that they really even know how to solve when their reputation does get bad, and they're all very worried about it. And keep in mind, these are calls they're making inbound, leads that customers want them to call them, oil change calls, your leases due, all very basic stuff, and they're very concerned about that.
And so then when we are kind of focused on technologies specific to solving this problem, is my perspective, and maybe you can validate this for the group, is, the technologies that we're talking about for Stir Shaken, certificate authorities, delegated certificates, I just don't think these are words or topics or concerns the brands are ever going to take the time to understand. and they don't realize how important the role they play in all of that technology achieving trust at the end. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, absolutely. And they would wholeheartedly participate and work to comply with all those if it wasn't so complex to do it. And they've got a lot of vendors who tell them they are complying because they don't quite understand it. We run into it all the time.
Yeah, yeah, and I do know that we definitely feel the question of, oh well, stir shaken's coming, that solves all my problems, or my provider said they implemented stir shaken, there's nothing more for me to do, problem solved.
Yeah, it'd be great if it was that simple, but
right. Linda's like, yes, that absolutely would be. So, you know, part of this week we've heard some presentations on the very technologies to support the delivery of brand identity. And so in wrapping up, you know, this week of SIPNOC, you know, our conversation will just continue to just kind of stay focused on the trust element of it and not the technologies. Although I think we all agree the technologies are the avenues through which brand trust can be delivered. But really understanding that this is the type of problem you just don't throw technology at, you know, from our perspectives. I think we're starting to learn that technology in and of itself doesn't bring trust. It's how we leverage it and the trust of the participants in this as well. So Linda, from the GA's perspective, and I know that you've been working on policies, procedures, infrastructure, technologies, I think it'd be really, you know, helpful to hear from the GA's perspective, some of the past things that you guys have worked on focused on this, and the things that you're still actively working on, all centered around, you know, enabling trust in this framework.
So just on a high level, stopping the bad stuff is a huge, huge effort. And there's a lot of really good people working together, and new tools are being introduced all the time, and it's great, it's wonderful. And they're generally introduced by trusted partners. But I appreciate all these great solutions, but I also jump to the big picture, because once a tool is in the ecosystem, how do you prevent the bad guys from using the tools to their advantage? And I think what you were saying was really key. The technology is great. Stir Shaken is a great technology. But if we didn't have the governance process, people would it would be Wild West, and those who were scamming the calls would scam them with AI attestations. So we have a governance process in place. But we still, I mean, always have to keep on top and make sure that the security, we maintain the security of the ecosystem, and we're always looking for holes. There's also a difference here with, you know, and I'm noticing the difference between what's happened with the governance authority process and some of the new tools that are being introduced now. Here there is a governance authority. You have to pass a test to be able, you have to be vetted to sign the calls. You have to be vetted. With some of the new tools, the question comes to my mind, who vets the better? When a new tool is introduced by a trusted partner, that's great. But can that tool be used by somebody who's not trusted to help bring the bad calls into the network in a different way? And so that's what I see is kind of the big thing that we need to focus on right now.
Absolutely, and that kind of leads into, Lulia, we've had some conversations around this as well. For, you know, there's the focus in thinking the technology will bring us the trust. And then we kind of had our aha moments of going, no, the technology doesn't bring it. It actually could be leveraged by fraudulent actors to deliver fake trust, right? So that's how, I mean, really, Lulia, our conversations, how this panel for me kind of came about. I was like, oh, this is a topic we have to discuss. So I would love to give you the floor here and just share some of your insights on that when it comes to the technology versus that higher level of processes and procedures.
Thanks, Rebecca, and totally echo all of what Linda just said. You're right, technology is the how, but if we all step back and as network technologists and business people, remind ourselves, what is it we're solving for? And one of our biggest problem spaces here is to authenticate Scott's calls, right? And those who've done a little bit of security and technology know that one of the ways that we authenticate is with cryptographic signatures, which is this whole stir shaken and public key infrastructure. But all of us know that the heart of that is the trust model. And I think we've already got a comment from David Holmes. Enabling trust is the key point to all of this. So thank you, David. That is absolutely kind of the cornerstone of this conversation. Has industry reached full end-to-end trust? No, you've just touched on it. And that's because we do have to identify those policies and best practices around know your customer, know your traffic that we heard this week, vetting the telephone numbers, vetting the branding data. And all of these steps become those key requirements and inputs to arrive at a proper design, taking into account one of the wonderful things that we have created through IETF-RFCs and ATA standards to finally come to the building of the physical storage and delivery of this precious data. Back to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, and that's really in line. Shamim, whenever I first met you and I learned very quickly, you're like, this is what I've been thinking about for so many years. And you've pondered on this for a long time and put some efforts into trying to solve it. And I think your perspective is just as unique and valuable to the conversation. So, give us some of your thoughts on that with regards from the technology and the trust and how we need to kind of break those two apart.
No, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Lulia and the team. So there is no silver bullet for sure, right? Because absolute trust and absolute security requires continuous improvement. And then how do we do it? Who comes at what context, right? We have to trust but verify. How do we verify it, right? At what context we are going to bring the verification in the equation. From the standard point of view, verification applied. But when it's a kind of a onboarding point of view, how that verification is going to get applied to, right? What systems gets involved within the mix, right? How the verification process gets applied. Like Linda mentioned, that how to vet the vetters, right? That's a kind of a really interesting aspect. And fundamentally, when you go and build a security solution, many different times people say that, hey, security remains the last attributes of the solution offering because they don't start from the beginning, is that source level security all the way to system level and whatnot, right? Similar with when you're building the trust, you have to start from the beginning. Otherwise, your system is kind of a compromise within the context of the weakest link, might be there, right? So that's why we can create a kind of a onboarding certification maybe for the systems or platform which are going to be onboarding. Also within that context, should we be having all the enterprise branding be onboarded into the system too, right? If we allow everybody, then bad is going to act badly. They are not going to consider that what is the goodness we are trying to achieve, right? So all these factors comes into play, means that we have to follow through the vetting process, authentication tools needs to apply the steps to allow the enterprise to onboard. And all in all, trust has to establish across data transport and then delivery too, right? So, means that any corner cases or any entry point, if it gets compromised, the whole system gets compromised. So that's the standard practice of the security in this regard.
And I think you're hitting on that point, which is a nice lead in over here to Scott. Shamim said it, Lulia said it, and Linda said it. It starts at the enterprise. So the enterprise is that source of truth of their identity. And that's not what's in question. What's in question is, who do we trust to validate that source of truth? So I want to know, what are your thoughts on, we kind of touched a little bit on the current available technologies for delivering the verified identity down the voice channel, but you hinted that the enterprises are on board. Can you just expand a little bit more of what it takes from the enterprise side and what they're willing to perhaps do and what they are wanting when it comes to their identity?
Yeah, and based off our conversations with hundreds of dealers, I mean, the concept is simple. They've got an entity that's well established. They're willing to provide the proof of identity. It needs to be easy and make it so they can verify their identity when they're trying to make an outgoing call, and do it across multiple service providers to do it. So the other end of that is to keep other people from committing fraud and representing their brand in a way that they don't want. So I think it's an easy concept, and things are, it looks like the technology is coming together. So.
Absolutely. And, you know, Scott, one thing that we haven't had conversations, I don't believe you and I have had this, but I do know it's a topic within this community that's addressing this trust challenge, is awareness of the brand in their dialing strategies as well, around how many calls are they delivering a day, how many calls are they delivering a consumer. And I know Volley kind of helps with that. I think it would be helpful with a group. Are brands just willy-nilly blasting calls, or is there some level of sophistication into the outreach?
It's all over the board. One of our new customers told me that they're managing 18 different logins for their salespeople to manage, and a lot of those are ways it can communicate with the customers. So their strategy and their reporting across all their channels is fairly disjointed. It's hard to pull those numbers together. In the regards to what they're blasting the customers or abusing the customers, the dealers, I'm sure there's some bad actors, but most of them are simply, if someone submits a web lead, they'll try them up to 4 times in 24 hours, and then they'll try them every couple days on the behest of the customer asking them. If it's an oil change call or a warranty call, they'll make 3 or 4 attempts over a few days to try to connect with them and let them know. So these are not the calls that consumers are expecting to be blocked. And you know, very recently I got a recall call. I would have hated to miss it. I mean, those are a lot of the calls they're making.
I know in the healthcare space, now this was years ago when I actually still worked on dialer deployment, and we were working with an insurance provider that had acquired quite a few other insurance. So it's like a Aetna or a Blue Cross Blue Shield, your typical healthcare insurance provider. And they had brought us to the table because they were having a challenge of going, we don't really know how many times we are calling an individual. Because through these acquisitions, each acquisition had its own dialer infrastructure. They realized that the patient existed over here under dental and also existed over here under the regular healthcare plan. So even before we even get to originating a call, it was a huge effort to just figure out, how do we have a single source of truth just for our consumer that we're trying to call, and understand how many times we're calling them, what is the pattern with which we're calling them. And this was way before we were talking about, this was before the strike force. And there was already awareness that that's not making for a good consumer experience. They're probably, you know, thinking these are unwanted or spam calls and don't realize that we're kind of one unit. So I think even that contributes to the lack of trust, and probably contributing to some of the challenges, at least at the analytics side, for the carriers have with knowing what calls are valid, what calls are wanted, and what's not unwanted. So I like to refer to this as more of like dialing hygiene. And I think it's fair to also put asks out for enterprises to make some changes on their side, while we have a huge heavy ask from the carriers and the service providers to put trust into it. There are some steps that I believe enterprises can take in order to streamline and allow for even trust with the communications that they are originating, and know who your customer is, right? We were always telling the service providers, know your customer. the enterprises should know their customers too, and how they want to be communicated with.
Yeah, and I think they're all willing. I mean, they spend, some of these stores spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in advertising a month, and they're big in the communities. I don't think there's any pushback. And to go one step further, we'll take not making an opinion on any certain type of call, but maybe there's some of these calls that people represent their brand. I mean, they want their customers to trust them and know that they're not making those calls. So anything that can be put in place is welcome to them.
So I want to kind of talk about, a little bit more of the kind of lessons that we have learned from some proof of concepts that have been out as well. I know I've participated in some. I know that, the wireless carriers have participated in some. So I would like to get thoughts from each of you also on, some experiences you had in trying to get the brand identity down through some of these technologies, and if there was any lessons learned from that exercise as well. Anybody can join in on that one.
Hi, Rebecca. I'll chime in with a couple of points. So first of all, thank you, Scott, for those insights. And that kind of touches on that first prong of what do we need to make this successful? Because the last thing we need is to erode the trust that we're building, and we need to differentiate Scott's clients' good calls and the legitimate calls from the bad ones. So it starts with good governance policies with a trust model. And that's everything from, Rebecca, you just touched on it, when Scott gets onboarded for, let's say, branded calling. Part of that process would be, hey, Scott, tell us about your calling pattern so that we recognize what's good. And so it's down to that level of sophistication with onboarding and vetting to understand those calling parties, hygiene and practices. And that's just one component of what we're calling best practices and governance practices from vetting and onboarding. And then it moves kind of forward in the call path to the service providers. And this is where and I'm talking about the voice service providers here, the methods of interoperability that we have to establish, both as originating service providers, terminating service providers, as well as transit providers in the middle, and all of those policies that protect the networks and the integrity of STIR, SHAKE, and RCD, and everything else we're transmitting on the voice channel. And then last but not least is to get that call to the device. And I think this is an opportunity where perhaps with STIR, SHAKE, we didn't necessarily have to bring in the device to the conversation. This is an opportunity where we absolutely have to. And I think Shameen is going to touch on that a little bit more from the consumer and the device perspective.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the device aspect of it. We can all do this work, but if the device chooses not to render trust, we're not quite taking it all the way to the consumer, which is ideally what we want, end to end from origination down to consumer. So Shamim, I know you've got some thoughts around that, like Lulia mentioned.
Right. So in terms of the device, that's one aspect for sure, because device is not all uniform, right? There is a variations there. But in terms of the solution point of view, the solutions are still evolving, right? Still we're learning through the process that what needs to be applied and what not. In the context of a trust building point of view, there is no centralized system for orchestration at this point, right? So because everything is like a bit distributed in nature, and that's the kind of a challenge brings into the security trust within the context of the all transactional point of view, right? And in the context of the validation point of view, there might be a way to validate on-call verification as well, because when the call is ongoing, so there is a way to verify there too. So the point here that the enterprise branding could be considered as a dynamic too, because not one type of branding is going to remain within the context of the state of the the enterprise's presence within the solution scope, right? So how we are going to handle that, right? So, and then is it kind of a change as the brand wanted? Because if we do the centralized, then it creates an issue on that regard, right? And then also on the other hand, when we are talking about the end point, because there is a context might be unwanted branded call as well. As a customer, I might not want it to receive the call from a branded party and I don't care about, right? So that means we have to have an option to give the kind of a customer a possibility to select, right? It's not a trust, it's more towards the option. How do we have that implementation in such a way that customer selects and choose, right? And so it all depends on that, how we are going to apply the solution at what use case we are going to apply to. So within that context, there might be a way to apply some sort of call categorization category as well. Based on the category, based on the enterprise representation, we can deliver a good representative solution for the end customer, right?
Agreed. And Shamim, while you're talking, I think there's a good question that came through that kind of feeds into this, and I think we can expand off of it. And it was with regards to SMS, short code messaging does have a short code provisioning process. That used to be a prior job of mine, was to fill those forms out and take the client through. And to the point that's being made is that, it was simple. So why don't we just reuse what was done with short code provisioning? I do have some thoughts, being that I was a part of that. But is there anyone else that would like to take lead on a response to that with regards to that trust process?
You go first.
Okay. I will say yes, with regards to knowing, especially at the time that I was leveraging it, we had shared short codes. I don't believe that we do share short codes anymore, but a short code was dedicated to a particular brand. In fact, there was, we were required to also list that particular short code in the company's name. We had some policies that our websites had to reflect if we were going to use short code messages, also the stops, the helps, just even the standards of it. And the process, although there was one process, it would take 12, sometimes 24 weeks or more, because there was a unified intake process, but then it had to go through each carrier. What made it challenging as an enterprise is that maybe one carrier was fine with my campaign, but the other carrier wasn't okay with it. So I'd have to make changes, and then I got to go back through each carrier. And that's one short code. We're talking lots of TNs, millions of telephone numbers. So that has to still be validated. The short code was validated because it was issued from a trust source. So the carriers never questioned the short code per se, because they identified who's going to issue the short code. So verification was still a part of it, but even that was a complicated process. But that was just one short code, one campaign, type that went down. Voice calls are way more fluid. We have the rotations of telephone numbers that can occur. And then it's also distributed far much more on who you leverage for your outbound voice than it is for your messaging. Typically kind of have one message provider. And interestingly enough, I felt like most companies who were in the space of messaging are a little bit more aware of the technology versus on the voice. So I like the simplicity and the concept of it, but I just don't think it quite applies over into voice. So I'll let some of the other experts, weigh in on that.
And Jessica, you're right. And I think that the concepts here is SMS and voice are totally different channels. And so while the onboarding, though, I do want to latch on to one of the comments, which is the vetting process is probably similar. And I do want to applaud that concept, because that is exactly what drove us to CTIA to establish best practices for the vetting of rich call data, learning from what was done in the SMS space. I just wanted to kind of take that piece of goodness out of that concept and conversation.
And Scott, maybe you have some experience. I know you've dealt with, I know this is not a messaging conference, so we're not going to go down the messaging path. But it is natural, I think, to try to pull from what we do in one to the other, because the enterprise, for them, it's like, I do voice and messaging. It's the same thing to me. And maybe you've got some experiences to provide with regards to challenges that come with taking from messaging.
Come with what?
With registering related to messaging as well.
Yeah, sorry about that. You know, as I'm listening to all this, I think it just has to be simple. That process, at least at the moment, is not as simple and straightforward as it appears to be, nor as buttoned up. And that's just my opinion. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on that. Really, just getting back to all these things. The enterprise, whatever they put in place, they just have to be confident that it's going to work and it's going to be simple and it's one place to do it, and then they'll all do it because it's in their interest to do it. At the moment, I've not felt that process was ready to go. So I think the concept is in line, though.
Yeah, and I think it comes that, what reigns true from the carrier's perspective, and I'll let, Verizon and AT&T speak to that, is they have an obligation to protect their subscribers, and they want to protect their subscribers from fraud, whether it comes down voice or messaging. And I think the pillars of it still stand true. They have every right to say, hey, even on the messaging side or the voice side, I want to know that I've got trust of who's gathering that information and then providing it down to the carrier and the process in the past, to get down to it. This would make a great topic, maybe not SIPNOC, but definitely a messaging and voice would be a really good panel to have, because both are trying to achieve the same thing.
One of the big differences, though, between voice and messaging is you can screen the message. You can look for keywords, and sometimes it's a little bit easier to identify.
That's true. I always forget that component, but yeah, the content, which is ultimately what you're trying to do with Stir Shaken, is add more information to the call, the reason for the call, who's delivering the call, because you're never gonna be able to get to the content. It is nothing more than a connector. Just connect this point with this point, and but at least inform it. Why do you want to connect to that point? And is it something that the consumer even wants to be connected about? So that's a very good point. Which I think leads in. And Lily, did you have something you wanted to add on that, or?
No, that sounds great. And I think we're going to continue to touch on it without delving too deep into the technology.
Yeah. So it does kind of lead into where we want to take the conversation on the the security gaps and vulnerabilities. When we think about, what's a use case that we'd want to focus on, or, where a fraudulent actor could leverage the system. And it really is about, fraudulent, those who want to defraud or do harm to the consumer. I'm not talking about annoying calls from legal entities. It truly is the fraudulent actors. What we don't want is them leveraging a logo or a name or any kind of identity around a call that belongs to a valid company. And we're referring to that as brand spoofing, which is something we need to be very cognizant about and build solutions around that it doesn't occur. So Linda, I know that you've been focused on security gaps and vulnerabilities for a long time. And I have heard you speak on this topic for several years, both from your role as STIGA and your experience in AT&T. So you touched on a couple little points, and I'd like for you to take a little bit more time to dive into them, but could you highlight some of the current gaps and vulnerabilities that we still need to address?
So I want to be careful here because, I'm always wary of, I know the bad guys are always watching us. I mean, they watch everything we do so that they can find ways around it, and they do a pretty good job of that, and we do a pretty good job of keeping up with it. I know that, I believe that this conference has been, I'm sure that this is an easy way for the bad guys to get information. It's a great conference and it's open to everybody. And there's probably some of you out there now that are trying to get some clues on what we're going to do next. So I want to be real careful and not give too many clues so that you can get ahead of us again, because it took a while for us to kind of catch up. But where I see, it's all in the big picture, okay? It's all, so AT&T, let's say for brand information, AT&T is only going to work with somebody that they have vetted and that they trust. So an AT&T vendor that vets the customer and, vets the brand, we're going to be pretty sure that that information is good and accurate, and they're only going to be providing information of trusted enterprises. But it's a big network and it's a complicated network, and we don't always just, obviously, we don't only complete the calls that we originate or the calls that are, the brand information that comes from our trusted vendors. So where are the vulnerabilities? How do we know that when we get a call with branding information, it's not a spoofed call, it's not a spoofed brand? Because some of the scammers, and I know I'm not giving this away because they've already figured this out, have figured out how to get blocks of numbers, and so they get the A attestation, but it really is a scam call. And are they going to start, or have they started, spoofing the actual brand on the caller ID? Have they figured out that? How do we trust that? Because we know, one day I got 4 calls of a DirecTV, which was at that time owned by AT&T, a DirecTV impersonator. 4 calls in one day. So the brand spoofing is going to, I imagine, increase if we don't stay on top of it now. So we've got to look at all of the opportunities, all of the points that the brand information can be provided, and make sure that we have processes in place to make sure, again, as we talked about before, we vet the vetters.
Yep. And that is definitely something that I think is an area and something we should be focusing on in the next quarter, 2 quarters of this year, is that topic. If we're still asking who vets the vetter next year, we're doing something wrong. That is a question that we need to be answering as an industry. I do think that it will take participation from the enterprise. I would love to see some consumer advocacy participants as well, speak on behalf of consumers, and then the service providers. Kind of going back to, all 3 are in sync on wanting to trust, but all 3 have to participate in a way for us to be able to get to that. And I know when I first kind of started into this space post the strike force, and I was trying to go out with the mantra of, times are changing, let's be more aware of how we communicate with our customers, let's be willing to be transparent. And there was a lot of resistance on what I was saying at these enterprise conferences, but that's not what I get today. So I believe we are moving in the right direction, where I think we're probably ready to really drive and answer that question, as opposed to bringing people kicking and screaming. I don't think that we will have that point. But Lily, I do want to, go back to you on, vulnerabilities. Is, my background is also privacy and security. So when I look at my security infrastructure, I definitely want to identify vulnerabilities. And the reason I'm identifying vulnerabilities is because I'm fully aware of what are the actions that can occur with that vulnerability, and then I remediate around it to ensure that that vulnerability isn't causing harm. So I know you've got some experience on what happens if we don't pay attention to the vulnerabilities and close the loop on those.
Yeah, great question. So I want to pick up on a thread that Linda started and then kind of bring in your question, Rebekah, which is, whether it's bad guys intentionally doing things or good guys kind of making mistakes, both are things that voice service providers and partners need to be extremely vigilant and protecting against. And we only have this one opportunity, I think, as an industry, which is really unique at the cusp of STIR/SHAKEN and starting out with RCD. We have this opportunity to earn Scott's trust and earn our consumers' trust who are holding handsets, right? And so what happens if we get it wrong? Well, the first one is we lose trust. We've already lost a lot of that. But more importantly is the financial loss. We have real stories. We don't have to make these up, right? And we're not tipping off the bad guys because these were in the news. Back in the fall, there were two stories that really hit home with me. One was a nurse that was caught off guard by an impersonation of Bank of America. And they told her with urgency and all the tactics they use, you've got to transfer and approve this transfer in your Zelle account. And the poor lady did, not realizing she was being scammed. And so that's just one example of, and now she had to recover from that. And that was just a simple spoofing of Bank of America's number. Another, perhaps more, what could have been tragedy, but ended up as a good story, was a Colorado hiker was caught in the mountains, and he needed a search and rescue team to come after him. And they were calling him. And that hiker was so accustomed to receiving robocalls that he just ignored those calls and decided not to answer them. Now, thankfully, the search and rescue team actually found him, but that just goes to show you that it's not just financial harm, it's actually personal safety as well if we get it wrong. So it's of the utmost importance that we get it right and we restore the trust and integrity in the voice channel as well as the other communication channels.
Speaking of your hiking, that's when I had my own personal experience, and I was hiking in Canada, and I don't want to take a robocall. I heard my phone ringing, and I did the same thing. I was like, I don't want to hear anybody. I'm in the mountains. I'm in the woods. Unfortunately, once I made it back down the mountain, I go to the convenience store because I'm thirsty and I want to use my credit card. It doesn't work. And so I called the bank, and the bank said, well, we saw some activity on your card and we tried to call you to verify. Therefore, we've blocked your card. And the only way around it was to issue a new card, but they would not mail it to me in Canada because it has to go to the house. That's the address on the account. So it was massively inconvenient because I think we kind of lost our trust that, oh, there might actually be truly calls that I need to answer that maybe I wasn't necessarily expecting. And I was kicking myself for not answering because I literally stopped and was like, I'm going to be zen. I'm not going to answer this call. That was the time I should have answered the call. So it would be great to get back to trusting that when that phone rings, it's actually somebody you would want to hear from. I know that's how it was when I was in high school, right? We'd fight over who got to answer if the phone rang. And then we would pretend on the flip side that we couldn't use a phone when our parents were wondering where we were. Can't get away with that these days. So something that we've talked about, is introducing, and I said it, brand spoofing. If we look at and focus on brand spoofing versus number spoofing, which STIR/SHAKEN should absolutely be taking care of that if we have the TN authorization, the verification of who you're working with. And I know in a lot of situations, we may not be able to get down to the brand behind it, but we do have at least the TN authorization. So maybe we're going to sign the call with B, and this topic is not to discuss the A, B, or C's. We've definitely had some of those conversations earlier this week, which were very insightful. But now when we get down to that level of trust around the A-level attestation, let's say we absolutely know who the entity is behind it, how do we prevent brand spoofing where we could potentially attach RCD passports to it or logos, whether in band or out of band? This is a conversation I think we need to start having as this branding technology continues to take off. What are those protections around it? And Scott, I know you kind of been quiet. We've been diving into carrier topics, but I think this is something that, would be beneficial to hear from the enterprise perspective on, is brand spoofing something that enterprises care about? And because it does exist today, I would say, does that create any hesitations to leverage technologies to expand more information to consumers?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, billions and billions of dollars are spent to reinforce these brands, not only at the OEM level, Ford, Toyota, et cetera, GM, but at the local level with these dealers in their communities. If there's not a process in place that they can trust, they're not going to want to buy into it because they just feel other people will abuse it. So this is very important that it gets solved, especially if you want the enterprise to adopt it all. Otherwise they're going to be assume it's used for harm. So.
And Lulia, from I know you're very close with the kind of the originating and terminating aspects of that. So, if we want to launch more identity information into this framework, can you touch on taking it deeper down into the infrastructure of that brand and that trust? Let's say we get it right on the upfront. And the enterprise is like, I love this process. I'm on board. I feel confident that I was able to get my verified information down to the originating point. Let's talk about everything else past that from the security perspective.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think this is where we as network providers need to do our best. And kind of picking up what Shamim said earlier is that every point in the path between Scott's origination call all the way to my handset on my desk, every piece of that process needs to be scrutinized and have best practices and processes to ensure that highest level of trust and integrity. So, for example, our standards will prescribe how to properly encapsulate Scott's Ford information or Chevy information and pass it along in an encrypted passport throughout the network. But let's say Scott wants to change up the Chevy telephone number with the logo because they've done a rebranding. It's up to the carriers to make sure we're keeping up as well with the most up-to-date information that has been vetted over and over and over again. So we have that first process, which is the handshaking of the vetted information, making sure we can retrieve that as quickly and promptly as possible, encapsulate it, and then start to set it down a path of protected voice channel all the way down to the termination point. And this is where we as carriers need to make sure we're adhering to standards. For example, we're making sure Scott's calling numbers are vetted, and therefore we're going to be putting an attestation A, for example, in the search shaking signature, because what we've observed in the ecosystem already is there could be a little bit of mistaken or injected, not quite sure, of people who are adding some rich cold data information in the SIP path that perhaps is B, and perhaps that's just an early implementation error. So all that to kind of reemphasize that it's up to carriers to be watching their networks and protecting their networks, but also exemplifying within themselves and interoperating in a way that continues to achieve that highest level of integrity between operators and all the way down to the handset.
To add to that, though, I think one thing just to note is the service providers don't have total control over the ultimate, display. So two points I wanted to make. Even an attestation may not get to the display just because of the lack of trust of the handoffs. And then second, it's the device. So we've all got to participate. I think that's been mentioned several times. And if the device manufacturers don't enable the ability to display the logo, then we can only provide so much information. So there's some things out of our control. Of course, we have specifications and we provide the specifications, but I can give examples of where, certain things are still not on the handsets that, for some providers, but they are for others.
And I think one of the things too, and thanks for saying that, Linda, we could just cut that out and make it a quote and get that reshared on the device side. When it comes to, you know, the carriers protecting themselves and we say, hey, I've done STIR/SHAKEN, I've done my robocall mitigation plan. I take that as a like set it and forget it, even though my plan maybe said I'm doing some monitoring, right? There, I still don't feel like a strong sense that there is this active, ongoing monitoring. And I know Frankel had a talk, I'll be honest with you, I don't remember which day, but he had a talk where he was talking about not only know your customer, but know your traffic, you know what's going on in your network. And so, you know, I just want to, you know, bring that over, elevate it up, because I think that is an important element. We can't get lazy with how we implement this. And I'm not saying that we have to be exuberant in our costs and go over the top, but there are mistakes, Lily, like you mentioned, that you're already kind of seeing that there might be some mistakes that are added to the information on the call. And so, you know, how are we monitoring? And I know from a network perspective, Lily, if there's any advice that you would give to those who are listening on how you're addressing that.
No, that's a great question, Rebecca. I think our network is just a treasure trove of information, but it takes time and effort to dig it out and mine it out a little bit. So David Frankel touched on the know your traffic, which is pieces of information we've dealt with for decades, your call duration, answer rate, things like that. And now what STIR/SHAKEN has added is just a tremendous an abundance of value in terms of what we're looking at, because we get to know the signer of the traffic. We get to see what at the station level, we get to see how many times they've signed a particular call, and we can tell if a call's been, you know, routed through the network or forwarded a couple times. So there's just an abundance of information that we could kind of mine out of the data that's in our fingertips. I'd love to, you know, collaborate with industry on other ways to do that. Not to mention, I think several carriers, including ours, have established honeypots, and the honeypots have kind of shown us where we have the good traffic versus the bad, and the behaviors that we're seeing out of some of the bad traffic. And like Linda said, you know, and we have call campaigns, especially with the credit card, where people may not be spoofing. They might be using legitimate numbers, and so those are signed with attestation A. Does that mean they're trusted? And I think there's some comments that, you know, we're adding metadata to the signaling, and we as voice providers have been constrained by not having access to the content, to the media. So we don't know if it's bad until it actually hits a voicemail or a handset or a pair of ears to know that it's bad. And so we're really dependent on the abundance of the SIP signaling that we have and whatever's packaged inside.
And I think it's also really important that we continue to work together, because AT&T has been looking at their data and looking at their traffic for a long time, and you know, has been blocking when we've, you know, identifying bad calls and blocking. But there are a lot of situations where AT&T may get a few calls and Verizon may get a few calls and somebody else may get a few calls, and where it's aggregated at a point like the industry traceback group, where you can take that information that AT&T by itself might not see it as bad, and identify where there's some problems. And so the more we utilize those processes, the better.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, you know, in a prior life, I was focused in healthcare, privacy and security, and kind of got to see it grow, participate in some organizations to put some structure around, you know, how do we protect patient data when patient data actually goes outside of the covered entity, the hospital organization. And it was like we're trying to put our arms around all this patient data. And there were obviously some rules that came out from HHS and some contracting and some standards. Once we started developing this, hey, we all have to work together. So I was representing as a business associate. I was facilitating the delivery of patient reminders and patient communications, and we were collecting data from, like, you know, blood pressures, did you take a medication? So we had to participate in how do we protect patient data. Once we started participating, then we all realized, oh, we're actually all victims of the same type of fraudulent attacks on the patient data. And the next iteration that we were going through was, well, now that we have all this data, why don't we share when we are having a security, attack that's taking our data, and we share it out into a private type network of, hey, received a attack through this vulnerability. Maybe it was an update that hadn't been made on some firewall, whatever it may be. We would promote it out, and it allowed everybody else to put defense mechanisms in, or at least become aware, we do have a vulnerability right there and it is being attacked. We'll shut it down, make the updates, do our notifications. But it allowed us to operate more of one against the fraudulent actors who really, they succeeded because we refused to talk and share data. So we were able to kind of elevate, and I know in healthcare, there's still a long way to go, but I almost kind of see some of that mirroring happening over here in that data share. And I can attest to the value that it has if you can let and give Verizon the heads up, we've got this activity coming on, then they can do something on their network. So Shamim, I want to hear from you on, looking at it from the holistic environment. And what are some of the approaches when it comes to the vulnerabilities and securities specific to like the enterprise brand? And I know you have some thoughts that would be beneficial for the group.
Yeah, sure. One thing we have to keep in mind and then also have to account for it. Good analytics is a must, because if the analytics are not good, we are relying on machine to give us some sort of representation. If the implementation is not qualified to the right level, then you would be compromised in a foundation element point of view, right? So that's also, I want to address that. But in the bigger context, right? So we are using multiple systems, many systems. The degree of separation of the systems are the ones when the complexity comes in. Once the complexity comes in, to deal with it, it is an evolutionary path. You cannot have the total complete solution holistically at a certain moment. It's a progression. Time is the essence here. It will be requiring time to get the maturity, and then we will be achieving the ultimate objective, right? So that's why we have to follow the standards, and policy also has to be applied, by which we all who are participating to drive the solution has to be really thinking deep about all the practice we follow through, right? The fundamental technology, what is out there, what we are basing on, it already exists. We are not reinventing the wheel to that extent. We are not doing the kind of a post-quantum computing type of solution, right? We are just using what exists. But using the existing technical foundational elements, we have to have the organized way of adaptability. We have to associate the technology in a more controlled way, and by which it remains a solid representation of the end-to-end solution, right? And that's why the adaptive design practice or solution practice is also a key within the context of what we are when we are progressing, right? If we don't have the flexibility of the adaptable solution path with the tighter constraint, then when the situation gets better, we don't have any way to change it. Then either we get a kind of a super tight scenario where we cannot apply the solution in a good way, or we start with nothing and then bad guy enjoy the whole ride, right? So we have to look into the holistically as we are talking about that scenario again and again in a different points. So the thing is that the looking into the system, looking into the orchestration, and looking into the solution end to end is a very critical.
Shamim, you are spot on, and you are so validated in what you are saying that I don't think I've heard anybody bring adaptive design practices to the conversation. And what that made me think of was, again, back, I'm not going to put my years in, but when privacy was first getting established as a concept, we really drove home privacy by design. That was the conversation I was having with our engineering group. We would build all these technologies with zero privacy as part of the design. So it was very costly to go back and then re-inject privacy and re-inject security. So I think that I love what you just said there. And that is a mindset. And it's so difficult to take the time and stop and look at what we're doing because we're just moving forward, do this standard, approve that, do this technology, meet the deadline. But we really have to be deliberate. And your point is so valid in everything that we're doing, that we have that awareness and a very strategic design, because we're going to be redoing it if we don't. I love that. Lilia, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I mean, both of you are absolutely correct. And unfortunately, in the past, security was an afterthought in design. And I think you're both hitting it spot on, that security and privacy is one of the key inputs to the design from the beginning of the conversation.
Absolutely. So I want to go now to focus on consumer, expectations, enterprise expectations when it comes to trust. And really, again, it's for the enterprise, it's trust about who they are. For the consumer, it's trust that this data represents who's really there. Simple concepts, very complicated to achieve. So, and from this, we should be asking ourselves, to the point, how do we deploy this solution with consumer trust in mind? So it's that having the pre-thought of the design being applied to the technologies of what we're trying to achieve. Linda, I know you mentioned the device limitations. I do think the consumers expect their devices to participate in the delivery. It is going to be interesting if we have a lot of momentum around trusting the data that's entered into the network, but the device doesn't do anything with that information. I think consumers are going to speak up. I really, really do. But we've kind of got to get that infrastructure established. And there is also a challenge to the carrier at that, the last yard, last, mile, whatever it is, and understanding that final delivery point of trust with the varied ways in which all of this data comes in. So eventually it all funnels down to the carrier having to decide, do I display this to this consumer, this subscriber, yes or no? But it's coming in from all different directions in very different ways, which is why we have standards. But how the data gets into the network, I think it's important for us to just talk about what are some of our expectations as we address the gaps that we have with trust. And then we also brought up, that was another point, app or appless also has a bearing on what is displayed. And Lulia, you were the one that kind of brought light to that when we were having our pre-conversations. And it's about the brand. The brand doesn't have control over what the consumer's device is going to do with their information. And I can't tell you how many times I have to tell brands about that, and they get very upset, extremely emotional when it comes to, I don't have control over the consumer's device. And there's this misunderstanding that just because you can verify who you are and associate your identity, associate a name and a logo, you do not have any control on what it eventually looks like on the terminating side.
You're exactly right. And this is where it gets to be a wonderful industry conversation with device technology, as well as service providers who may have apps that ride on some of those devices, to all come together as a team and ask ourselves, are we able to render this trusted experience to the consumer in a way that the consumer can consume it? And then also taking into consideration that consumers will probably want a somewhat consistent experience as much as we can, whether it's across service providers or whether it's across handsets, to have that similarity. And back when we worked on StoreShaken, we never had a standard for display framework. So now I think, we have this great, unique opportunity to come together with Rich Call Data and work with our handsets, work with apps, and work with the applications and service providers to try to formulate as best as we can, as consistent as we can, an experience for the consumers, so that our enterprises can hopefully achieve their goal as well, which is maximizing that opportunity for the consumer to trust and engage in that enterprise communication.
Absolutely. And I think and something that the enterprises are not aware of, and you kind of made me just think of it right now, is they're going to provide over their identity. They're going to provide over their logo. They have no say really or input into the infrastructure that will eventually deliver that. And I know we've talked about, there's a URL rendering as well. These are all areas that are outside of the realm of the enterprise's ability to apply security to it. So I imagine there also will come a point in the future where they're going to want monitoring. They, as in the enterprise, is going to want monitoring on how were my branded assets delivered. Is it truly what I provided and not something where the integrity got compromised along the way and now something else is being displayed? And I think that's where the branding maturity has to, eventually get to as well. But I mean, that's a heavy lift. But I think it's an expectation, one that we can say.
Absolutely. And some of us have been working diligently to ask ourselves those very questions. How does Scott make sure that that Ford logo or that Chevy logo is protected in a website that then some device is going to have to retrieve? So the same basic security principles that we've applied for decades on web hosting and access from the device to that website all absolutely apply. And then, of course, it's not just service providers who are worried about their consumers' experiences. The handset manufacturers themselves are going to be worried to say, am I going to download any malicious malware from the website I'm about to hit? So it's absolutely a very intense conversation where security is definitely at the heart, and protecting Scott's logos is absolutely near and dear to all of the conversation here.
I think I would like to see maybe on the next SIPNOC, I think there needs to be a conversation just around that topic alone, because this is agnostic to implementing STIR/SHAKEN. I think this is something else that sits on the outside, or another layer of security that you add to your signing solution. Is what is the test to verify the actual contents and a decision making to render or not render. You could still deliver the call, but rendering the logo information, I mean, as what I tell customers, I'm like, branding can be one of the most exciting things, and it's also the most terrifying solution to a brand if it is not protected. It could, and even on the enterprise side, which is what I'm always telling them, know who has access and authority within your organization of who can provide the branding information to the provider. You get, and when I was doing my security, I always was thinking about, ultimately, it's employees who are my greatest threat. They were always my greatest threat. I can put in all the infrastructure, but that employee who has the password, they can do a lot of damage and a lot of harm. And that employee can become disgruntled, and they can take it out and then hightail it out of the office. So the same thing could happen with regards to the branding assets. So I tell them, I said, you need to make sure that you trust and also do your own verifications on what branding assets someone's throwing over, so they're not delivering anything compromising or to attack the company, because you could blast millions of calls and present something that maybe you did not want presented as a brand. So we have to think about that. Shamim, you mentioned some concepts around what does it mean for the enterprise brand. Do you want to kind of expand on that?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the brand, right, we are calling it enterprise brand. We have a set of data attributes we are using as a reference to implement or apply the brand, right? But if we look into after 5 years, after 10 years, what's the way it's going to look like? It's going to get morphed into a different way. Who knows, right? Because everybody is in a virtual world. Who knows how this thing is going to get popped up and whatnot. And one of the questionnaire also asking peers, Goldman asking that should you be using an NFTs, right? So there is a different nuances are going to come into play, right? So we have to just think about the attributes, not in a static form, but in a kind of a attribute representation form. Otherwise, we're getting kind of stuck with that kind of, okay, I have data field 1 represent A, data field 2 represent B. It's kind of a prescriptive type of representation, and also it kind of flows through. If I wanted to inject something, I would be able to inject in a controlled way. we have to have that kind of a dynamic aspect built in to give a kind of a good run for our bad friends, right? So also as a carrier, right? So we have to look into that when we are talking about the end-to-end point of view, right? We have to do the onboarding as well as the brand delivery, right? So, and then in the context of the what are the things we look into, right? We focus on the service layer, then the control layer and the transfer layer. All different layers gets applied to be able to deliver the essence of the integrity of the solution on top of in conjunction with the brand as well, right? So, and then also one other thing we mentioned, Linda mentioned, and then Julia mentioned, and you, Rebekah, also mentioned the device is a factor, right? Not all the devices are same, right? So some of the devices might not have a display. So then what do you do with that, right? Is it kind of a bad? So then how do you represent the brand representation through that kind of a not displayable representation, right? So we have to come up with some other form of a delivery mechanism too. So that's why we have to be working in conjunction with device OEM to make sure that whatever they are coming up with matches with our solution offering, right? And also our customer bases are not always adapting to the new and greatest, right? Due to the economic factor and all this situation, right? So we have to apply the backward compatibility with the latest and greatest and then upcoming compatibility too, right? So, and those are the things we really have to pursue. And then we have to, again, as we discussed before, so holistically look into the solution from the point A to point Z. Otherwise, we'll be having some issue. And then being a carrier, we have to, being a kind of an originator as well as a terminator, both end of the spectrum, we have to look into the whole aspect of the solution footprint in this regard. And then also, sorry, one other point I would like to mention. So in the context of the brand, as I mentioned before, so I might not like to get a branded call because due to for some reason, right? Not me as a customer, right? Then should we be giving a kind of option for the customer to opt in, right? Because we are thinking that, okay, brand is going to give us a norm to get a kind of a more take rate. But is it really going to happen due to the fact that brand might be feeling that, hey, I'm branded, I'm kind of a good, now I'm going to start calling left and right. And then as a consumer, I would be really not happy, right? So those are the things also need to be accounted for.
To me, you are just like creating all kinds of new things for me to think about every time I talk to you. That's we have not discussed, you know, the consumer expectation. And I never thought about once the brand has been associated with the numbers, now it actually is a little bit more in the consumer's face, just how often that you're calling and when you are calling. Whereas I just get telephone numbers and I get multiple calls a day. I actually don't know if it's all the same entity that's calling me and they're just rotating out and trying different numbers. I can tell you nobody's thought of that. No one has mentioned that I've seen. So I think we definitely need to get the consumer perspective brought into this, and maybe, you know, the carriers, I think you can kind of sit there in the consumer role too, because you're building solutions for the consumer. But I don't know, have you done any polls or research to find out how consumers would react and respond to this? And to me, I think that's a brilliant point that might change the behavior of the consumer.
Yeah, we do have an active activity in that space too, right? We look into, as I said, that being a little bit major carrier as we are, so we live in the holistic spectrum, right? We cannot just kind of think of one way versus other. Otherwise, it misses the mark of our end customers' experience, right? CX is very, very vital for us to be successful. If the customers are not happy, we are not going to get the solutions representation in the right order, right? And also one other point I would like to mention that when we are having the enterprise to get on board, we also have to set up an expectation for them to understand that what are the potential way they are going to get the experience for their eventual paid service, what we are planning to pursue and then driving to the customer end, right? If we set up the expectation, then the education is going to continue grow, and then eventually industry is going to get mature, because we cannot have a kind of a, hey, you don't need to know that approach. You have to educate whoever is coming on and then follow through and carry forward and then get the solution represented in the right order. So that way they would understand the gap and they would understand that how they have to get educated, and also looking the future, that what is the way future is going to come.
I think those are very valid points, and that's definitely something I think we need to see more of from anybody who's offering solutions in this space, is to have real expectations of what can be achieved so that the enterprises are informed. Otherwise, they're just going to have this like bad experience from the get-go and not want to come back to it. So I think that's very helpful. Linda, now we have 10 minutes or 9 minutes left here. But I do want to get from the GA perspective of some expectations, you know, with the application and use of the standards, and maybe on the oversight and enforcement aspect as well.
So I think, I mean, the standards, and you're talking about branding, right?
Correct. Yeah. So from the GA's perspective, what are your expectations?
Well, you know, I think this goes beyond, I mean, well beyond the GA. I mean, the branding issue. In one of the expectations is that we, and when I say we, I don't mean service providers, I don't mean enterprises, I don't mean vetting, you know, vendors. I mean, all of us come up with some kind of a solution so that we have a process, so that we have assurance that those who are vetting the enterprise information have been vetted and are doing it legitimately. So I think some of that is well beyond the capability of the GA. You know, the expectation would be, you know, and I think the industry needs to come together to develop best practices. I'm not going to come up with a bunch on the fly and say everybody should adhere to these. I mean, I think we talked about a few that are probably the right things to do, but you know, those have to be discussed within the industry, such as maybe the branding information only is passed when there's an AI attestation. But that's not the only thing by itself.
Exactly. We have a little bit of time left. Scott, I want to hear from you with regards to kind of the expectations from the enterprise as we move towards more information to the consumer.
Yeah, and just to go back to Shamim's point about the consumer, these enterprises are wildly worried about their reputation, and if they had, and most of our customers are worried about how often they contact their customers. They want a good relationship with them. I'm sure they would come together and meet them well there. You know, an expectation from the enterprises is that that they have a system that works, and the communication channel will be the responsibility of the carriers. The carriers will help them with that. They just really want to know what the rules are. Your comment about reporting would be incredible, because it feels kind of black boxy at the moment. It's kind of one of those, it's not their fault, but their problem right now that stresses them out. And they didn't introduce any of the vulnerabilities that have been used to cause these problems. So they just want to know they're going to get a good ROI out of it and how to play by the rules. And I think it's a very, very simple expectation. I think the carriers are going to have to come a long way, and I know it's complex. I mean, even listening to you guys, my head's kind of spinning of what you have to solve, but I think that's what they expect. So
yeah. So with that, I kind of want to wrap up with each person. If you'd like to add, you don't have to, no pressure, but just kind of a summary point that you would like people to take away from what we discussed. From me, it's if we can't trust the entry point, then the whole system is opened up to vulnerability. So I'm really focused on, I want to take this year to focus on what we're doing about that entry point layer and everything out to the brand and establish some trust in that environment. Lulia?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. For me, I'd say it's just a call to action for industry, devices, enterprises, consumers to really come together and help us enable both the best practices, and then we'll figure out the technology to render the best and trusted experience that we possibly can.
Shamim?
Sure. We are trying to basically block the bads, right? So that means we have to remain good. So the thing is that the journey is to prevent bad and to support good. If we collaboratively work among ourselves and try to identify gaps and find the best for our eventual objective, we will eventually succeed. The thing is that the proper due diligence is a must, and challenging ourselves and getting the best is the necessary elements. So we should be collaborating among ourselves, not remain in a silo. And if we do so, then we will have we will be ahead of those bad entities in the mix. So we really have to prevent that bad with respect to our goodness.
Scott, and then I'll let Linda close it out.
I'm going to sound like a broken record. The enterprises are willing to participate. It's in their best interest too. They need help from the carriers. They will provide the information they need that's needed to verify the information and why they're reaching out to the consumers, and so that trust can be given. And I know that they'd work well together. It is something that needs to move forward this year, no question.
Thank you. And Linda?
Okay, I would say think like a scammer. Don't act like one, but think like a scammer. Always look for where are the gaps, where do we need to add the additional security and keep them out and keep the trust in the ecosystem.
Agree. All right, well, I want to thank everyone for participating in the panel and all of those who listened in and the questions. Hopefully you saw we were kind of weaving them into our conversations here and getting them addressed. So Mark, I will welcome you back to close out this session.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all for your great conversation. Linda, Lulia, Shamim, Scott, Rebecca. Thank you, and thank you, Numerical, for your support of SIPNOC 2022 as a platinum sponsor. Very much appreciate it. We're very grateful. I should also say that we're in active discussion in the SIP Forum to put on an enterprise-focused event that's going to include banking, other financial services, insurance, healthcare. It'll cover call branding and other similar type topics and important issues related to the enterprise space. So stay tuned. There'll be more on that coming down the road. And before I close down, let me tell you what's coming up next in about 30 minutes. We're going to hear from Chris Wendt, who's going to give us an update on the rich call data standards that he's working on. And I hope all of you will join us for that. And again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.